Good morning, America. Today I want to continue our discussion of World War I by talking about weapons. World War I, as the first modern 20th century conflict, involved the wide-scale use of a number of new weapons that had not been used before in the conflict. There were also a couple of weapons that were used that were not necessarily new, but had been significantly improved compared to how they were in previous conflicts. Two weapons that were widely used in World War I that had been significantly improved from previous conflicts were rifles and artillery. The basic infantry rifle in World War I is called a bolt-action rifle. It fires one shot at a time. To reload it, you rotate the bolt up and pull it back, which ejects the spent shell. You then slide a new bullet into the breech, rotate the bolt forward and down, and then you're ready to fire. You fire one shot at a time, but it's quick and easy to reload, as opposed to the muzzle loading guns that they used during the American Civil War. A good rifleman with a bolt-action rifle can fire one round every couple of seconds, and which is a relatively good rate of fire and with considerable accuracy at a distance. The bolt-action rifle is mostly a distance weapon, a distance fighting weapon in World War I. You use it for shooting at people across no man's land who might, show their heads out of the opposite trench on the other side of no man's land. Another weapon that's widely used that is not new but definitely improved for World War I is artillery. Now, cannons have been around for a very long time. Cannons, in fact, were the very first type of firearm ever invented. They've been around for centuries. But by the time of World War I, they're not just cannons, they're artillery pieces. So, old-fashioned cannons, they fire a small, typically solid cannonball a distance of perhaps a mile, mile and a half, like what we saw at Castillo de San Marcos and St. Augustine. By contrast, artillery in World War I are much bigger. They fire large shells that are explosive. They're packed with high explosives, and they have a range of several miles. So oftentimes, the gunners don't even see where the shells are landing. You have a team working together. You have the gunners who are firing the guns, and then you have a spotter who's out front somewhere and then communicating back, okay, that shell fell 50 yards short of the target, increase your elevation slightly, and they work together. Artillery dominates the World War I battlefield. These shells, they're very powerful, they're huge, they're packed with high explosives, and when they come in and hit, there's nothing left. If it falls on a building, the building is destroyed. If it falls on an animal or a person, then whatever was there is gone. And instead, there's a hole on the ground. No man's land is pockmarked with these shell holes from the artillery. And typically what will happen is guys will run, if an artillery shell hits and creates a new hole, then guys will run and jump in it because they're superstitious and they think that wherever a shell hits, it's not going to hit in the same place twice, so then they run and jump in it. These shell holes then fill up with water because it rains quite a bit in northern France, and then guys actually die from drowning on the Western Front by falling in these holes and drowning with all their stuff on. All right, so that's artillery and rifles. Then we have a number of new weapons that are invented for World War I. The first of these is the machine gun. Now, the machine gun is kind of a counterpoint to the rifle. The rifle has still a relatively slow rate of fire, albeit much faster than guns did in the 19th century. They're accurate at a distance. You use them firing one round at a time, very specifically targeted at a distance. By contrast, a machine gun is about spraying the battlefield with as many bullets as possible without really bothering aim. You're just throwing bullets out there. Machine guns are primarily a defensive weapon, whereas rifles are typically an offensive weapon. So with rifles, you're trying to pick off guys who show their heads above the trench on the other side. With a machine gun, when the other side is attacking you across no man's land, you open fire with the machine guns to try to mow them all down as quickly as possible before they get across no man's land. And frequently, that's exactly what they end up doing. Then you have airplanes. The airplane is a brand new invention. Orville and Wilbur Wright flew for the first time in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1909. The World War I began in 1914. Airplanes were first used in combat in the very first battle of World War I, the first Battle of the Marne, when the French used airplanes for reconnaissance to tell them where the German army was located. World War I battles take place in 3 dimensions. You've got people fighting down on the ground, and then you've got airplanes buzzing around up in the sky shooting at each other. Now, the airplanes are very primitive. They're small. They typically have two sets of wings, so they're biplanes. Propeller driven, usually a single pilot. Occasionally you might have a plane that has a co-pilot behind, but usually just one pilot. And he's armed with a machine gun that fires forward through the propeller, and the airplanes are shooting at one another. There's little or no instrumentation. The airplanes are flown by the seat of the pants. They can only go up in good weather. If they fly into a cloud, the pilots will get disoriented and crash because they don't have instruments. They can't fly in the rain. They can't fly into a cloud. They can't fly at night. But when the weather is good, they're out in force shooting at one another. And the air aces of the day became heroes in the popular imagination for their daring exploits in the clouds. All right, next we have submarines. The submarine is also a new weapon for World War I, although, with one exception, the world's very first ever submarine was actually invented during the American Civil War by it was actually a Southerner. He built a prototype submarine which had propellers that were hand cranked. He managed to convince some friends of his who were as foolish as he was to take it out for a test run beneath the waters of the harbor in Charleston, South Carolina. They launched the submarine into Charleston Harbor and were never heard from again. They sank and all drowned. Incidentally, that first submarine has been recovered and is now in a museum in Charleston, South Carolina. So that initial catastrophe set back submarine construction quite a bit, but eventually other people had worked on it and figured out how to actually make a submarine that wouldn't immediately kill everybody on board. So submarines were a new weapon for World War I. Both sides used them, but in particular the Germans used them. German submarines are called U-boats, which is short for the German word for submarine, which is Unterseeboot. These submarines were used by the Germans in an effort to try to sink ships that were bringing supplies from the United States over to Great Britain. Now, their efforts to do that were of limited success because the World War I submarines are still rather primitive. However, this, as in many other respects, is a dress rehearsal for World War II because the Germans will try the same thing in World War II with much better success. Right, then we have tanks. The tank is also a brand new invention for World War I. They don't come out until towards the end of the war. The first tanks are hitting the battlefield on the Western Front really in about 1917. They are large, they are heavy, they are very unreliable, they're constantly breaking down. But the biggest problem with the tanks is that nobody has a clue how to use them properly in battle. Also, the Western Front is pretty much the worst place that you could possibly try to use a tank in battle, because the Western Front battlefield is a sea of mud, pockmarked with shell holes and crisscrossed with trenches. That is not favorable terrain for a tank, of any sort, let alone the primitive ones that they had in World War I. So the tank doesn't really make much of an impact on the battlefield in World War I. When they do use them, they're typically used as stationary, static, strong points, which is not the best way to use a tank. You'd be better suited using artillery or machine guns for that purpose, or stationary fortifications. But again, it's dress rehearsal for World War II. They're experimenting. Finally, last but certainly not least, we have poison gas. Poison gas is a brand new weapon for World War I. And poison gas is used in numerous different battles on all fronts. Well, maybe not Africa, but certainly on both the Eastern and Western fronts in World War I, by both sides. Both the Central Powers and the Allies did it. Now, there are three main types of poison gas that are used in World War I. These are chlorine gas, phosgene gas, and mustard gas. Each of these gases works on a different principle, but all of them are nasty stuff. Chlorine is an element. You may be familiar with it if you've ever gone swimming in a swimming pool, because in small doses it is used to treat pool water. However, in larger doses it is poisonous. It is used on the battlefield. It was used in the form of a choking green gas. Right, then we have phosgene. Phosgene was the first of the nerve agents, which it works when the human body is exposed to it. It messes up your nervous system. It causes your body's nervous system to go haywire. And it paralyzes you. And then when you're paralyzed, you can't breathe. So you try to move to take a breath, but you can't move. And then you can't take a breath, and then you die. So it kills you by asphyxiation, but not quite the way you would think. Not through not the gas itself asphyxiating you, but rather the gas paralyzes you. And then once you're paralyzed, you can't breathe, and then you die. It had a characteristic sweet smell, according to those who experienced it and lived to tell the tale. Then we have mustard gas. Mustard gas was the most commonly used gas in World War I. It is not called mustard gas because of any connection to the tasty yellow condiment. On the contrary, it is called mustard gas because of its color, but we're not talking bright yellow French's table mustard here. It's more of a dirty brownish color, so we're not talking table mustard here, maybe more like a Grey Poupon, something like that. But it has no other relationship whatsoever to the condiment other than the color, and even that only rather remotely. Now, the reason it's called mustard gas is just the color. Now, mustard gas is the way it kills you in a very inventive fashion. Mustard gas, when it's exposed to moisture, as in water vapor, as in the water vapor that is naturally present in the air, especially in a damp place like Northern Europe, the mustard gas reacts with the moisture in the air, and as a byproduct of that chemical reaction, it produces hydrochloric acid. And when you breathe the gas in, when it enters your lungs, it reacts with the moisture in the air in your lungs and the moisture in the tissue in your lungs to create hydrochloric acid. And then you have hydrochloric acid in your lungs, and the acid burns your lungs from the inside out. And that's how mustard gas kills you. Now, there is only one way to defend against gas, and that is to wear a gas mask, which is, of course, also a new invention for World War I. The gas masks of the day, they're pretty scary looking things. They're made of leather, basically. It's a hood that goes over the entire face. There's two round eye holes made of glass, and there's a big canister with a filter in it down here made of metal. Now, the gas masks were reasonably effective. If you put it on, it would save your life. However, you have to put it on. And you have to put it on in time before you breathe the gas. Often, the thing about gas is that it's a silent killer. You don't hear it coming. You may not see it coming. You might see it coming if it's during the day. But for that very reason, oftentimes gas attacks happen at night. And so at night, in the dark, you can't see it coming. You can't hear it coming. You may or may not smell it coming, but by the time you smell it, it may already be too late. So oftentimes the only warning is one of your fellow comrades crying out, "Gas! Gas!" And you have maybe a fraction of a second to put on your gas mask, or you're done for. So the question is, do you have it with you? These things, gas masks, are heavy and bulky to carry around. They're made of leather and glass and metal. They don't have lightweight materials in the early 20th century, so they're heavy and clunky to carry around. But if you can't get it on in time, then oh well. The only other option is that these gases are all heavier than air, which means that they sink to the lowest point. Well, the lowest point on any World War I battlefield is the trench, and that's where the people are. So it's a weapon that's tailor-made to be deadly on the World War I battlefield. However, that does leave an option for escape. If you're lucky, if you can manage to get to higher ground in time, you might be able to get above the gas. There are stories of people who manage to make it to higher ground and they're able to survive the gas attack, but they're surrounded by a sea of gas on all sides. And they just have to wait for the gas to dissipate. And for that, you're wholly reliant on the wind. Speaking of the wind, as it relates to poison gas on the World War I battlefield, the learning curve with poison gas had to do with the delivery mechanism, how they were going to deliver the poison gas to the battlefield. Now, the Germans were the ones who tried this first, and they first tried it on the Eastern Front. Their initial delivery mechanism was to take a tank of the stuff, set it on the battlefield, open the tap, and let the gas come out, and let the wind blow the gas to the enemy. Now, you can probably see what the potential issue is with this delivery mechanism, which is the wind is not a very satisfactory delivery mechanism. It might change direction. And in fact, that's exactly what happened the first time the Germans tried this. The wind changed direction and blew all the gas right back on them. And more Germans died from the German gas attack that day than did Russians. So because of the risk of the wind changing directions, they figured out just opening the tank and letting the wind blow is not a satisfactory delivery mechanism. So instead they switched to using artillery shells. So poison gas and artillery become linked. And so what they do is they take one of those big artillery shells, but instead of packing it with high explosives like they normally would, they fill it with poison gas. That way, when they shoot the shell, these guns have a long range. It throws the shell far enough away that the gas is not likely to blow back on you and your guys, even if the wind changes. Poison gas is such a horrible weapon that after World War I, all the countries of the world got together and signed a treaty agreeing that they would never, ever, ever again use poison gas, and that doing so anywhere under any circumstances was a war crime. And remarkably, this agreement has been kept to, with only very few exceptions through world history since then. Poison gas was not used in combat in World War II or other major world conflicts of the 20th century. There have been a few exceptions, though. One exception, most notably, of course, was the Holocaust, but that was not used in combat. Another exception was in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq used poison gas. And just a few years ago, in the Syrian Civil War, the dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, used poison gas. There have been a handful of instances, but thankfully it is extremely rare. And that's it for weapons of World War I. Next time I'm going to talk about how America got in this whole mess. See you next time.